All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another edition of Social Studies with Mr. Regas. Now, today we're picking up after our Stages of Genocide lecture. We talked about the different stages, and essentially what we learned was that genocide is not something that exists in a vacuum, and it's also not something that happens overnight. There's 10 stages to genocide, and so we looked at the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide a little bit when we were talking about the different stages of genocide. Now, the purpose of us discussing that was to show that these things take time. People don't just wake up one morning with a divide split between two different nations or ethnicities or groups and decide that it's time to exterminate somebody. These are the sort of things that take organization, it takes preparation. But most importantly, what you should have learned from that was the way people are talked about plays an extremely important role here. And so the first stages of genocide that we look at are things like classification and symbolism and dehumanizing. We're going to look specifically at the Rwandan genocide today. Now, we're not going to go over the stages of genocide because we did that in the previous lecture. This is to just give a little bit more information about what happened and the outcome of it. Now, it's a little bit of a disclaimer. Some of the information in this lecture is very disturbing. There's not many events that have happened in the world's history that are more disturbing than the Rwandan genocide. I don't really know what to say as far as that. This can't be talked about without getting into some of the horrendous details. So my apologies if it bothers you. However, being sheltered from this information does nothing for us, right? We have the privilege of learning about this without having gone through it. And so we want to talk about these things so that we can recognize injustice when it happens and speak out. Because when people don't do anything, that's why bad things are let to happen. Quick little overview. Now this is the Rwandan genocide in a sentence. During the Rwandan genocide of 1994, members of the Hutu ethnic majority murdered more than 800,000 people. Most of them are of the Tutsi minority. Now, this took place over about 100 days, so the rate of killing is extraordinary. If you remember from the previous lecture, some of those lines creating us versus them are implications of colonialism when Belgium had colonized Rwanda, prioritized Tutsis at bits of history. We'll get into that a little more here. This is a map of Africa showing where Rwanda is. So just south of the equator, in kind of central Africa. Now, first off, I want to just look at the image that I have here. Rwanda is not a big country. So I've taken Rwanda and I've placed it over Edmonton and a section of Alberta. That blue border, that is the entire country of Rwanda. That should give you an idea of the size. It is not geographically large. However, it is over 12 million people. Alberta alone only has something like 4.3 million. So you can imagine over 12 million people crammed in that blue space on our map here. It's a very dense country. So the 22nd densest country in the world. Now, as far as ethnic tensions go, what you can see is that the breakdown between the two main groups is significant. 85% of the population belong to the Hutu ethnicity, 15% to the Tutsi. It also has an overwhelming agricultural economy. You can imagine, though, like especially us that live in Alberta, we're used to big farms. It would be difficult to have big farms because land would be very scarce in the country of Rwanda, being how small it is. Now, going back, Rwanda's colonial period saw both German and Belgian colonization. After World War I, German control of German control of Rwanda was handed over to Belgium. The Hutu Revolution. Leading up to the 60s and Rwandan independence in July 1962, Hutus attempted to force Tutsis to flee the country. So one of the things we saw happen was that Tutsis fled, including the Tutsi monarch. They went into exile, and the country was then declared a republic. 1973, a military group installed Major General Juvenal Habyarimana, moderate Hutu in power. He led for 2 decades, so quite a long time. Now, during this time period, a lot of the Tutsis that fled the country went into the neighboring country of Uganda. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the following slides, but they ended up helping Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, gain power. And so they formed their own military groups in Uganda, and this becomes significant for later. So 1990. Now again, I mentioned Rwandan Tutsi forces had been staged in Uganda, and they had helped overthrow the Ugandan government, placing into power Museveni. So they had military experience. They were there for a while. And in 1990, forces of the RPF, so the Rwandan Patriotic Front, consisting of mostly Tutsi refugees, they invaded Rwanda from Uganda. So this is what is called the Rwandan Civil War. This went on for a few years. Eventually, a ceasefire led to negotiations, and Habyarimana signed an agreement calling for the creation of a transition government. And so this would include the RPF. Now, Hutu extremists were angered about this. They did not want to share power with the Tutsis, especially after the RPF had led a 3-year civil war. 1993, October, a United Nations mission, UNAMIR, or the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, it was established by the UN Security Council. They went in to try to assist in the Arusha Accords. This was meant to end the Rwandan Civil War. So in October 1993, we see United Nations troops entering Rwanda. Now, it's important to note that they came in under what's called a Chapter 6 mandate. So they were not there to act in a military manner. They were not there to attack and defend. They were there to try to help the peace process. April 6th, though, 1994. And I'll just say a little side note to this. I want you to be thinking of the stages of genocide we talked about previously and what was happening in Rwanda leading up to this. April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Habyarimana and the Burundi president was shot down, leaving no survivors. Within an hour of the plane crash, Hutu militia groups set up roadblocks and barricades, and they begin slaughtering Tutsis and moderate Hutus. So when we talk about the stages of genocide, all the preparation and organization that was going on before this leads up to it. Now, you should also remember that on Rwandan TV channels and radio stations, they were using dehumanizing and polarizing language to really drive home the differences between Hutu and Tutsis. They were using terms such as cockroaches to describe the Tutsis. And so when this happened on April 6th, the message was sent out to start the slaughter. The term they used, or the message they gave, was cut down the tall trees. This was when the Rwandan genocide occurred. Now, we also learned that sometimes in those stages of genocide, people are used as like scapegoats, or it takes kind of a spark to start something. It's actually theorized that the shooting down of this plane carrying the Rwandan and Burundi president was actually done by Hutu extremists. Now, you might say, why would you do that? But again, This is that spark that allows them to start the genocide, which they had been preparing for. So slaughter spreads across Rwanda. Now, again, these images are very hard to look at. But again, this is a real event. This is something that millions of people lived through. People still live in the shadow of this. So for us to be sheltered from some of these images or events, it doesn't do any service to people that actually have gone through this. And by sheltering ourselves from these images, how are we to be able to learn how to respond, or how are we to learn how to maybe stop something like this from happening, right? So in the course of about 3 months, 100 days, 800,000 people are slaughtered. Local officials and government sponsored radio stations call on ordinary Rwandan civilians to murder their neighbors. This is not just the Rwandan army versus Tutsi civilians. It's important to note that, and we talked about this before, it takes the government for a genocide to occur, right? You can't just have groups go about doing mass murders, because if the government doesn't go along with it, they'll try to stop that. We don't see this happening here, right? The government is sponsoring this. Interhamwe groups, youth militias, they're drunk on power and alcohol, slaughtering. But part of this too is the role of individuals here. Now, how does an individual go from living next to somebody of a different ethnicity to being convinced to murder them? That's those stages of genocide. But innocent, or innocent maybe isn't the right word, but regular civilians, they also have a role here. People are called to murder their neighbors if they are Tutsis. And people are carrying identification cards. And so if you're asked for identification, you have to show it. Otherwise, you'd be assumed you're a Tutsi. When this starts happening, the RPF resumes their fighting. So you have the genocide occurring and also a new civil war raging. Now, they end up gaining control over most of the country by early July. So this is essentially the only reason why the Rwandan genocide stopped. Now, what happened was that most of the people carrying out the genocide, they weren't so much organized as soldiers, and they were more just focused on killing of civilians. So the RPF, who came in with, a goal to take over the country again, they were more organized. And what they were doing is they'd actually go behind like enemy lines and they would try to rescue Tutsis and then bring them back to land they had controlled. But it made it easier for those organized soldiers to stop the militias because, again, they were focused on doing so, whereas the militias were focused on just slaughtering. And so by July, the Tutsis end up gaining power again, effectively ending the genocide. Now, in conclusion, and I'll talk about this more at the end too, and there's a link here for a few videos that I want you to watch. More than 2 million people, nearly all Hutus, flee Rwanda, crowding into refugee camps in the Congo and other neighboring countries. And after its victory, the RPF establishes a coalition government. We're going to get into some of the pretty horrendous details here. Because again, these are real events. This is real acts of, war crimes and genocide. One of the tools that was used in this genocide was rape. Now, these numbers are not exact. These are some estimates, and some of these estimates they think are really low. But approximately up to 500,000 women and children were either raped, sexually mutilated, or murdered. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, this is the first time they handed down a conviction for the use of rape as a weapon of war, and the first time rape was found to be an act of genocidal rape. The instances of rape were so high that they figure between 2,000 and 10,000 war babies were born as a result of this. And even them live with a stigma in society. They're referred to as les enfants mauvais souvenir, children of bad memories. Now, this is so hard to comprehend, but even those who were born out of rape, the stigma they face, so they too live with that us versus them. Innocent children. Hutu extremists released hundreds of patients who were suffering from AIDS from hospitals, and they created rape squads. So this was intended to infect and cause a slow, inexorable death. So infection rates for AIDS more than doubled after the genocide. So it's not just the impact or the immediate impact of what happened through things like death and murder, but the spread of disease being used as a weapon also. So people still living with this. Reproductive capabilities were also targeted in Tutsi women. Tactics such as sexual mutilation would occur. They would use machetes, knives, sharpened sticks, boiling water and acid to try to prohibit Tutsi women from being able to reproduce. Some researchers even suggested that nearly every female survivor over 12 years old had been a victim of rape. Estimates between 250,000 and 500,000 women and girls. So I said it's hard to picture any event that's been more horrendous than the Rwandan genocide. Now, the international response. The Rwandan genocide has largely been seen as one of the biggest failures of the United Nations. The international community largely remained on the sidelines during it. So I mentioned that UNAMIR was established in 1993, trying to help end the Rwandan Civil War, and UNAMIR lasted to March 1996. UNAMIR Commander Romeo Dallaire, a Canadian, he was alerted to the plan of Hutu power militias planning to exterminate the Tutsis several months before April. However, nothing was done about this. Peacekeepers were operating under Chapter 6 mandate, so again, they were rendered quite powerless to intervene militarily. Early on in the genocide, 10 Belgian peacekeepers were killed. They were unsure about their authority to defend themselves, and so they handed their weapons over to the Hutu extremists. They ended up getting killed after this. And so the United Nations Security Council vote in April 94 ended up withdrawing most of the UN peacekeeping operations. When more and more word of the genocide came out, a lot of this was done through the efforts of Romeo Dallaire, and these reports of the genocide spread. The Security Council voted in mid-May to supply a more robust force, including more than 5,000 troops. By that time, though, when the force arrived, genocide had been over for months. So the United Nations peacekeepers were essentially ineffective at stopping any of it. For a period of time, they were guarding Tutsis and Hutu moderates in one of the soccer stadiums in Rwanda, except they were eventually told to withdraw, and then everyone inside was slaughtered as well. And so when we talk about peacekeeping, this one is usually brought up as a failure. I'm just going to go back to this slide for a moment, because the effects of the Rwandan genocide, they still exist today. So in July of 1994, Paul Kagame and the RPF troops, they gained ground. Eventually, they capture the capital city of Kigali, and 2 million Hutus flee to neighboring countries, particularly Zaire, later named the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it makes sense why they fled. They feared reprisals. This is one of the largest refugee movements in human history. 2 million fleeing, and so they're setting up refugee camps in horrible conditions. Thousands begin dying immediately from diseases such as cholera or dysentery. But we also see troops that begin attacking from over the border. And so some of the Hutu extremists, they would jump back into Rwanda, lead some attacks. And Rwanda sent troops into those camps on counteroffensives. The Ugandan army was helping the Tutsis, or the RPF here. So what we see is several military groups end up waging war in Zaire. What happens, though, during this time period in 1997, this war that they enact in Zaire, they end up conquering the whole country. At the time, the president of Zaire was Mobutu Sese Seko. He ended up fleeing into exile and getting replaced by Kabila. And so this was known as the First Congo War. We had Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and Angola all fighting on one side. Now, eventually, though, what happened was in Zaire, which was then renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Laurent Kabila was getting sick of foreign interference in his country. So he was being influenced a lot by Rwanda, and he decided that he didn't want that foreign control in his country anymore. So he ends up supporting the Hutus to get support. So he kicks the Rwandans out. Some military groups and countries are supporting him. Others move into the Eastern Congo. And we start seeing in this time period around 1998, a year after the First Congo War, we see the Second Congo War starting, also called the Great War of Africa or the African World War. So Laurent Kabila calls for things like Tutsis to be lynched in the streets in the Congo, similar to what was happening in Rwanda. Eventually, this war starts. This was from about 1998 to July 2003. The Great African War was the worst war since World War II if we're looking at casualties. Over 5.4 million have died from this conflict by 2008, whether it's disease, starvation, or from the fighting itself. And today, it's still very fragile, especially in Eastern Congo. There have been peace talks, but both Hutus and Tutsis still fear for their extermination. And so some of the people who were carrying out the Rwandan genocide today have rebel groups in Eastern Congo that might be doing things like carrying out attacks or even running mines. So the Rwandan genocide, even though it happens in 1994, the impact of it is still felt today. And we do look at it as a failure of the United Nations, but there's more to it than that. But that's the Rwandan genocide. Thank you for listening.